How many people would you need in a room before there is a 50 odd that two of them share the same birthday? Welcome to the Identity Navigator. I am Rohit. Today, we are exploring a mathematical curiosity that reveals something profound about leadership and about why even the most visionary executives need statistical literacy to avoid catastrophic mistakes. Here is a question: how many people would you need in a room before there is a 50 odd that two of them share the same birthday, right? So let's understand this. If it is a normal year, that's if it is not a leap year, it has got 365 days. So if I have 366 people in the room, there is a 100% chance that at least two of them will share the same birthday, right? I'm just extending my question to say or ask, how many people would you need in a room before there is a 50-50 odd that two of them share the same birthday? Believe it or not, most leaders and executives I ask have said 180, half of, or approximately half of 365, right? Seems logical, but the actual answer is 23 people. This is the birthday paradox. And honestly, it's not really paradox at all because the technical language is it's a veridical paradox, which means it seems wrong, but it's mathematically perfect. And it teaches us something critical about leadership. Our intuition, or sometimes called vision or visionary, no matter how seasoned, systematically fails us in domains we weren't evolutionary designed to navigate. You know, maybe you could see some of these things that we will discuss in your own leadership style. Maybe you could see in some of the leaders across your companies or some of the leaders that you have worked with. But I'm pretty sure you will relate to this material as we navigate through this in some of the people that you have worked with, maybe yourself, and it is a chance for us to be better as to why that leadership skills decays over time and what can we do about this. Now, Steve Jobs was arguably one of the most visionary leader of all times. Jobs understood that this in a way that separated him from every other leader of his era. He's famous for saying, "Don't listen to customers, they don't know what they want." But what people miss is that Jobs was obsessively data driven. Every Apple product underwent thousands of hours of rigorous testing. He surrounded himself with quantitative analysts tracking everything from supply chain metrics to battery life to pixel perfect usability. Jobs didn't choose between conviction and data. He understood that visionary leadership requires statistical literacy because without it, your conviction becomes delusions. And in this episode, we are going to explore why experienced leaders lose effectiveness over time, how cognitive biases exploit the gaps in our intuition, and how to build the statistical literacy that separates genuine visionaries from confident fools. Let's start with 23 people and one room. The birthday paradox stands as one of the mathematics' most elegant demonstration of how profoundly our intuitions can mislead us. It reveals a critical vulnerability in leadership, the dangerous gap between common sense and statistical reality. For leaders navigating the complexities of modern organization, this mathematical curiosity offers a profound metaphor. Just as our brains systematically underestimate combinatorial probability, experienced leaders often overestimate the reliability of their accumulated intuition, creating blind spots that compounds over time and threaten organizational effectiveness. The birthday paradox works because humans think linearly while reality operates combinatorially. When considering whether someone in a room shares your specific birthday, we are we are making 22 comparisons in a group of 23, a straightforward 6% probability. But the actual question asks something fundamentally different. What is the probability that any two people share any birthday? This creates 253 unique pairs, right? I'll not go into the maths and bore you with this, especially in an audio format. It would be impossible to follow, but it's calculated as 23 into 22 by 2, and there is like n number of opportunities for a map, but you will have to trust me on the math part of it. The counterintuitive results emerges from complementary probability. So rather than calculating the chance of a match directly, mathematicians compute the probability that all of these 250 pairs, remember the math that you trusted me on, have different birthdays. So at 23 people, the chance of two people sharing the same birthday becomes 50.73, or the chance that there is more than 50% probability of two people having a shared birthday. This mathematical precision exposes how poorly equipped human intuition is for assessing complex probabilities. Our cognitive architecture evolved to recognize patterns in immediate tangible experiences, not to intuitively grasp exponential growth, combinatorial explosions, or counterintuitive statistical truths. The lesson extends far beyond party games. Leaders making consequential decisions face similar gaps between what feels right and what the evidence actually supports. The allure of common sense in leadership carries a seductive logic. Executives spend decades accumulating expertise, pattern matching across countless situations, and developing that mysterious quality often called business acumen or charisma. Yet research reveals that this accumulated wisdom, unchecked by data, becomes increasingly unreliable and sometimes catastrophically wrong. Consider the epidemic of data overload obscuring organizational reality. Leaders today process an estimated 120,000 data points daily. Yes, this deluge paradoxically buries the very instinct executives pride themselves on. When forced to choose between spreadsheets and frontline feedback, leaders increasingly default to what feels familiar rather than what evidence suggests. One retail CEO, convinced by rosy projections, pushed a massive store expansion while ignoring frontline reports of declining fruit traffic. The decision seemed to make common sense: growth equals success. And the outcome was bankruptcy reorganization. I have also researched and find out the similar stories about Boston Chicken, which eventually became Boston Market and is currently struggling uh, to keep its foothold in the market. And this problem intensifies as leaders gain seniority. Research on long tenured executives reveals a troubling pattern. Success breeds complacency. CEOs who achieve early wins often develop an inflated sense of their Midas touch, dismissing threats and becoming anchored to strategies that worked previously. Some examinations of major business failure found that executive overconfidence contributed to 70% of the cases, eventually, leaders essentially becoming victims of their own accumulated experience. This dynamic explains why CEO tenure has declined, falling from 7.7 years in 2024 to just 6.8 years in 2025, the lowest since 2018. Organizations increasingly recognize that long tenured leaders without mechanism for continuous learning and perspective challenges become liabilities. Their common sense ossifies into rigid thinking, unable to adapt as context shift and old assumptions become obsolete. And you don't want to become that statistics, right? That is why growth mindset is important, and we'll touch on some of these in the later part of this podcast. Statistical illiteracy now amplifies these vulnerabilities. Only 25% of the workers feel confident with data skills, and fewer than half of the executives feel truly data literate, despite 86% acknowledging that career success depends on it. This capability gap means leaders routinely misinterpret evidence, fall prey to cognitive biases, and make decisions that seem sensible but lack statistical grounding, just as the birthday paradox trick intelligent people into dramatically underestimating probability. Innumerate leaders systematically misjudge risks, opportunities, and causal relationships. And then they make decisions based upon the common sense, which everybody agrees with, which everybody will not fault them if it fails. But eventually, it was the failure of that judgment and decision because of either the overconfidence or data illiteracy. The birthday paradox illuminates a specific cognitive limitation, our difficulty with combinatorial thinking, but represent just one entry in a catalog of systematic errors that plague executive decision making. There are many research into leadership effectiveness revealing that cognitive biases don't merely distort individual decisions, they create cascading failures across organization. One of the biases, overconfidence bias, stands as perhaps the biggest trap for successful leaders. Studies of CEO reveal systematic overestimation of abilities across three dimensions: over precision, means excessive confidence in the accuracy of one's knowledge; overestimation, which is an inflated assessment of one's actual performance; and overplacement, believing oneself is superior to others. All of this leads to overconfidence bias, and the consequences prove measurably destructive. Overconfident CEOs, identified by their tendency to hold stock options far longer than rational financial model suggests, were 65% more likely to pursue acquisitions, many of which destroyed shareholder values. How many acquisitions you have seen which have gone south? How many acquisitions you have seen that did not make sense in the longer term, right? And all of this is coming from that overconfidence bias. I'll give you an example. Nokia's collapse exemplifies this dynamic. Leadership overconfidence in their market position and underestimation of smartphone competitors like Apple and Android led to a strategic paralysis. The executives possessed deep industry expertise and had successfully navigated previous technology transitions. Yet that very success generated false confidence, binding them or blinding them to evidence of disruption until recovery became impossible. Another bias that I've always seen is confirmation bias. And this confirmation bias actually compounds these errors by creating information bubbles around flawed assumptions. Leaders naturally seek data supporting existing beliefs while dismissing contradictory evidence. I've always believed, right? Data can tell any story. You know, the same data point, you can show it as a positive or you can show it as a negative, right? And once you have confirmation biases mixed in, it becomes impossible to see the true information coming out of that data, and what you are actually doing is just supporting your existing beliefs and proving that you are data driven. Because when executives already decides on a strategic direction, they place disproportionate weight on information validating their choice and discounts feedback suggesting course correction. This creates dangerous echo chambers where dissenting voices face subtle or overt suppression, depending on the culture of your company. And organizations lose the diversity of perspective essential for sound decision making. Customer experience leaders provides a telling example because confirmation biases shape stakeholder perception from the moment a new CX leader joins an organization. If the team believes CX initiatives are superficial, they interpret every action through that lens. If they expect bureaucratic slowness, they see it everywhere. The bias becomes self fulfilling. Leaders struggle to overcome initial impression because people filter all subsequent evidence to confirm their pre existing views. Right? So it's sort of like a self fulfilling prophecy. You can also look into recency bias, which is the tendency to overweight recent events and undervalue long term trends, particularly afflicts leaders navigating crisis or reacting to immediate pressures. A facilities manager who doubles generator spending immediately after a once in a lifetime storm exemplifies this pattern. I've seen that in the recent AWS outage. And how did many leaders across many companies decided to act on it? Right? And the vivid memory of disruption overwhelms statistical analysis, showing the investment's poor expected value. Leaders similarly overreact to recent customers' complaint, quarterly earning misses, or competitor moves, losing sight of broader patterns and strategic priorities. You must have heard it in jest that the work that you do during the last quarter only matters in your appraisal rating. It is nothing but recency bias at play. And these biases, all of the biases that we have spoken about, they don't operate in isolation. They interact and reinforce, creating systematic distortions in organizational judgment. An overconfident leader develops anchoring bias around their initial assessment, then exhibits confirmation bias in seeking supporting evidence, and recency bias in reacting to near term results, and attribution bias in blaming execution failure on others rather than flawed strategy. The result: intelligence, experienced executives making remarkably poor decisions while convinced of their sound judgment. The solution to intuition's unreliability seems obvious, right? Like, okay, so intuition is not a great tool here. So what do? We become data driven, and leaders should ground decisions in empirical evidence, leverage analytics to reveal patterns invisible to casual observation, and use rigorous measurement to track outcomes. It all seems very obvious, but research strongly supports these prescriptions as well. All of us have heard this. Data driven organizations demonstrate superior performance across multiple dimensions. They identify opportunities earlier, allocate resources more efficiently, respond to threat faster, and make fewer catastrophic errors. Right? But you have to make sure that you do not let confirmation bias creep into this. Data literacy now stands amongst essential leadership competencies as fundamental as negotiation, communication, or people management. Leaders who pair judgment with insights from data make demonstrably stronger decisions than those relying on intuition alone. The scientific method's application to business strategy, hypothesis formulation, controlled experimentation, evidence based adjustments provides exactly the disciplined framework leader needs to counteract cognitive biases and test assumptions. Right? So there are many studies which reveals that adults make approximately 35 decisions daily, underscores why relying exclusively on gut feeling proves insufficient. The volume and complexity of modern organizational decisions overwhelm even the most experienced executives' capacity for accurate intuitive judgment. Data provides essential grounding, revealing patterns, quantifying risk, and enabling informed choices. Yet, data driven leadership carries its own perils when pushed to extreme. Leaders who worship at the altar of analytics risk analysis paralysis, overlooking human insights and optimizing for measurable metrics while missing strategic imperatives that defy quantification. There is a nuisance here, right? It is the data imperative, but it is not the data dogma. Jeff Bezos articulate this nuance precisely. All of the data that gets used in business is essential. If you are in business and you are not looking at your data, he says, trust me, your competitors are going to beat you. But if you are only looking at your data, you will also not win, or at least not win big. The limitation of data only thinking stems from a fundamental constraints. Data describes the past, not the future. Analytics reveals pattern in historical behavior, customer preferences as they existed when measured, and correlations in previous context. This makes data invaluable for incremental optimization, adjusting pricing, refining operations, improving existing products. But breakthrough innovations require imagining possibilities that don't yet exist, for which no data trail has emerged. And this is where we talk about disruptive innovations, which illuminates this trap. Incumbent organizations excel at analyzing current markets and implementing sustainable or sustaining innovations that serves existing customers better. They possess extensive data about customer needs, competitive dynamics, and operational performance. Yet, this very strength makes them vulnerable to disruptors who create entirely new value curves, targeting non consumers or emphasizing attributes the incumbents' data suggest customers don't value. So, focusing religiously on market data traps companies into incremental thinking, that concept of 1 to n rather than 0 to 1, which blinds them to transformational opportunities. So, organizational pursuing innovations must therefore create something which is it's called a data barrier, a protective layer shielding the innovation process from the gravitational pull of existing matrix. This doesn't mean ignoring data. It means recognizing that data cannot answer about genuinely novel possibilities. Leaders need courage to make conviction based bets on future their spreadsheets cannot validate. So you see this paradox, right? I've been talking about, hey, don't just use conviction, and now I'm telling you, but also use conviction. Right? This is why you get paid a bunch of money. But let's talk about this visionary paradox, right? This mythology surrounding visionary leaders like Steve Jobs often centers on their apparently pure intuition. Executives who trust their gut, ignores conventional wisdoms, and create product customers didn't know they needed. This narrative dangerously oversimplifies reality and has ruined an entire generation of product managers, all cosplaying like Steve Jobs, by suggesting that bold instincts alone drive success. The truth is actually more, as always, more nuanced and instructive. Jobs certainly possessed remarkable product intuition, famously declaring, it's not the consumer's job to figure out what they want. That was some statement. And he rejected traditional market research, noting that the customers can only describe desires in terms of what they already use. When asked what they wanted, they replied better, faster, and cheaper MS DOS machines rather than imagining the Macintosh. This conviction based leadership enabled Apple to create category defining products that customers didn't request because they couldn't conceive of them. But Jobs was simultaneously incredibly data driven. Post intuition, every Apple product underwent thousands of hours of usability testing. He surrounded himself with quantitative analysts who tracked everything from supply chain matrix to battery life to retail performance. The iPad's seemingly intuitive brilliance emergence from rigorous validation. Tests prove user couldn't hit targets smaller than 44 pixel. Battery tests demonstrated the necessity of 12 plus hours of life. Designers discovered the read tap symmetry requiring separate optimization for readability versus tap accuracy. So, Jobs' intuition set strategic direction. We need a tablet. But mountains of data made that vision actually work. So, his genius, according to me, right, and I'm in no position to judge him, but his genius lay not in ignoring evidence, but in understanding which decisions require convictions before evidence could exist and which required exhaustive validation. He didn't choose between data and intuition. He masterfully deployed both in their appropriate contexts. And not just Jobs, but Bezos articulates a similar philosophy with characteristics precision. He says the biggest breakthrough, the most important ideas, customers don't know to ask. He explains you have to dream and you have to use your intuition and your gut and your heart. Yet he balances this with a critical caveat. When customer anecdotes conflict with dashboard matrix, trust the anecdotes. It usually means you are measuring the wrong thing. Data illuminates patterns, but human judgment must interpret significance and identify blind spots. The integration of conviction and evidence defines genuinely effective leadership. Visionary executives don't abandon data. They understand its limitation and know when transformational decisions require leap beyond what current information supports. They build cultures where analytics inform strategy without constraining imagination, where testing validates ideas without crushing experimentation, and where conviction drives bold moves while evidence prevents catastrophic errors. The research on conviction leadership versus reflective leadership reveals this balance as essential. Pure conviction without reflection will breed inflexibility, dismissal of opposing views, and potentially disastrous stubbornness. Leaders can sometimes become so wedded to their vision that they ignore mounting evidence of failure. Conversely, excessive reflection without conviction produces indecisive leaders. People who are like, do you think it's the right thing to do? What do you think about this decision? It sometimes leads or breeds indecisive leaders who delay actions endlessly, seeking more data when decisions require courage amid uncertainty. At some point, is more data really going to help you? Right? Like, will you ever have enough data to make that judgment call? And you have to make that judgment call. But sometimes the culture rewards those who do not make mistakes. And that is where the culture is so very important, right? It's not about all the other things that you hear. This is about what is the company working on. It's the very fabric of how company operates. So the most effective executives practice paradoxical leadership, a both and mindset that simultaneously embrace seemingly contradictory imperatives. They are deeply personal yet inherently collective, confident yet humble, directive yet empowering. They ground decisions in data while trusting intuitions for breakthrough moments. This paradoxical thinking proves especially valuable in volatile, ambiguous environments where neither pure analysis nor pure instinct suffices. right? Another thing that we spoke about was the statistical literacy as leadership competency. We saw that this capability proves especially crucial because high quality data and poor quality data look superficially identical to statistical illiterate consumers. Right? We have all heard about things junk in and junk out, but you mostly don't know whether it was junk in. You just start seeing the out. Now you have to define, was that out a junk or not? Right? Which essentially means that executives without the skills to assess data quality based decisions on fundamentally flawed inputs. You must have definitely seen that either you or they mistake correlation for causation, generalize from unrepresentative samples, and draw conclusions unsupported by the evidence they believe validates them. We have spoken about combinatorial complexity a few times here, so I will not touch on that. But birthday paradox really proves that. Right? So what does statistical literacy here means? I'm not asking leaders to become data scientists or data engineers. I'm just asking them to cultivate three capabilities: pattern recognition, seeing trends and anomalies in business matrix before they escalate into crisis. So, say for example, a software leader noticing customer support tickets gradually increasing over 3 months, recognizing a pattern, suggesting product quality issues rather than support team problems, enabling early intervention that prevents customer churn. Right, so pattern recognition is one of the three capabilities. The second is critical questioning, developing healthy skepticism about matrix and the discipline to probe beneath surface matters. Right, uh, when presented with performance data, statistically literate leaders ask, how was this measured? What assumptions underlie this analysis? What aren't we measuring? Right? Could this pattern result from compounding factors? This questioning stance prevents accepting analysis at face value and reveals hidden assumptions. Context integration. And this is the third capability, understanding that data never speaks for itself. It requires interpretation within organizational, market, and strategic contexts. Leader must recognize when metrics capture what matters versus when they optimize for easily measurable proxies that distort priorities. So, a lot of what we thought about could also look like, hey, this is all theoretical, but there are two things that you need to be aware of. A, you need to be intentional as you step into these leadership roles, or if you are into those leadership roles, you have to identify those biases. But for organizations building this data literacy among leaders, you should focus on practical applications rather than theoretical statistical courses, right? Like, don't just assign a training and ask them to complete a statistical training. Schedule regular sessions where executives review key metrics with fresh perspective. Make them review these business cases from Nokia's and Kodak's and Nike's of the world. Require business cases to include comparative analysis and create accountability for retrospective reviews comparing predictive outcomes to actual results. Have you compared your predictive outcomes to actual results and identify why that delta was? So this experiential learning should be given, which is focused on practical application, and this helps building uh, learning build the pattern recognition and contextual judgment that formal training alone cannot develop. And I would be honest, I've not seen too many great trainings out there. There are some which are phenomenal, but most of the trainings are very theoretical, check the box exercise here, right? Another thing that I would like to touch on is there is a gap between intuition and reality at a single point in time. But leadership effectiveness faces an additional threat: the temporal degradation of skills and judgment when leaders rely exclusively on accumulated experience without mechanism for continuous learning and perspective renewal. So we continue talking about, hey, continuous learning, it is our culture and whatnot, but these are the downsides to it if that is not in the culture, or if you do not have a growth mindset or a continuous learning mindset. Research on leadership tenures reveals actually this troubling patterns. While I was looking through this, experience obviously matters. Nobody is denying. Seasoned executives possess knowledge, relationship, and pattern recognition that newer leaders lack. But this advantage erodes and eventually reverses without deliberate effort to challenge assumptions and incorporate new framework. And that is why long tenured leaders who remain in the same organizations face several compounding risks. So I could say that sometimes success breeds complacency, learning opportunity diminishes, relationship dependencies create compliance risk. Long tenured build relational capital both inside and outside the organization. While valuable, these relationships can morph into liabilities when leaders prioritize loyalty over objective merit. They surround themselves with people who think similarly, creating groupthink and suppressing dissent. External relationships becomes cozy, reducing critical distance and potentially crossing ethical boundaries. Right? So I wouldn't go into the ethical boundaries, but definitely there is a friction by design in the organization, right? So identifying these patterns could be helpful. Sometimes uh, the disconnect stems largely from leader applying mental models shaped by past environments to current challenges requiring different approaches. So essentially what they are doing is essentially using outdated common sense in context where it no longer applies. So poor decision identifies several predictable failure models. I can predict it without even knowing you. Relying too heavily on past experience, right? Nobody is judging you. So I'll tell you that this is how poor decisions are being made. I can predict those failure modes. Relying too heavily on past experience, lacking clarity of purpose, inability to see opportunities, and mismanaging resources. Why can I predict these failure modes? Because they share a common thread. They result from static thinking in dynamic environment. Leaders using judgment shaped by yesterday's realities to navigate tomorrow's challenges systematically misread situations. And what is the antidote to this atrophy? It is the learning agility. If accumulated experiences alone proves insufficient and potentially counterproductive, what distinguishes leader who remains effective over long tenures from those whose judgment degrades? Simple, learning agility. The willingness and ability to learn from experience and then apply that learning to new situation. It describes a mindset and behavioral pattern, actively seeking novel experiences, extracting lessons from both successes and failures, and rapidly applying insights to unfamiliar contexts. And the critical importance of learning agility emerges from the accelerating pace of change in business environment. Because traditional leadership competencies, industry knowledge, operational expertise, relationship management retains value but prove insufficient when context shifts rapidly. Leaders face situations without precedent, technologies requiring new skills, and strategic challenges that historical playbook don't address. And in these environments, the capacity to learn quickly outweighs the static knowledge leaders possess. Right? So, what are the traits of a learning agile leader? Treat uncertainty as opportunity rather than threat. Actively seek experience outside your comfort zone. Extract lessons systematically from experience. Apply insights across contexts. Right? And for organizations, you can cultivate learning agility through deliberate strategies. Promote a culture that values curiosity over certainty. Provide stretch assignment and cross functional exposure. Implement robust feedback system. Model learning at executive level. Right? Senior leaders should openly discuss their own learning journeys, share mistakes, and extracted lessons. And they should demonstrate genuine intellectual humility. Invest in development programs emphasizing learning how to learn. Create experiences that build that metacognitive skills, right? We spoke about it: reflection, pattern recognition, adaptive thinking, and rapid skill acquisition. And this approach addresses the atrophy problem directly. So, what is the framework for balanced leadership? Let's combine all of these things together. Leaders must be rigorously data driven for decisions where evidence exists and can guide action, while trusting intuitions and convictions for transformational choices. The key is knowing which type of decision you face. It's not data versus intuition, it's identifying the context in which data versus intuition has to be decided. Experience versus learning, conviction versus reflection, common sense versus statistical literacy, right? So, for data versus intuition, you have to identify the context. For experience versus learning, experience experience becomes expertise when paired with learning agility, and without it, it just ossifies into outdated dogma. For conviction versus reflection, we spoke about paradoxical leadership. Embrace that. It embraces both simultaneously. Paradoxical leadership embraces both conviction versus reflection simultaneously. For common sense versus statistical literacy, it is the intuitive judgment serves well in domains where human cognition evolves to be effective, but systematically misleads in probabilistic, combinatorial, or complex system scenarios. So it's again comes back to that context of which is used where. The birthday paradox illuminates all four tensions, right? Our common sense intuition about birthday probabilities proves spectacularly wrong because the problem involves combinatorics, right? So the remedy isn't abandoning judgment, but building complementary capabilities. Develop statistical literacy, create decision making frameworks, institute reflection practices, build learning agility, foster culture of constructive challenges, practice intellectual humility, right? This six thing, this framework that I just gave you, doesn't eliminate the need for judgment. Leadership ultimately requires making calls amid uncertainty and incomplete information. It does, however, dramatically improves the quality of that judgment by counteracting system biases, updating outdated assumptions, and pairing intuition with evidence in appropriate proportions. So the 23% birthday problem demonstrates mathematically what every executive should internalize psychologically. When facing complex, counterintuitive domains, even highly intelligent, deeply experienced people systematically misjudge realities. The answer is not 180, the answer is 23. The leaders who thrive aren't those with the best intuition. They are those who have built systems, capabilities, and culture that prevents intuition from becoming liability. Who know when to trust their gut, when to trust the data, and critically when to recognize they need both. You will not believe it, but I was scrolling on Instagram when I came across this birthday paradox, and I just had to share my leadership framework in context of that birthday paradox with this. So you have to blame somebody, blame that reel, because as you would imagine from the size of this episode that I haven't yet checked, oh, we are at almost 45 minutes, that I'm very passionate about this. but I thank the creator of that Instagram reel who actually made me want to talk about this today with you all. Thank you for listening and for taking this journey with me. I would love to know what you think. You can reach out to me via LinkedIn. You can send me an email at theidentitynavigator@gmail.com. I'm also at Substack, and I read everything. I'll put this info in the show notes. And until next time, this is Rohit, your identity navigator.